You know what's fascinating? Before skyscrapers, before cobblestone streets, before the name Montreal ever existed, this land was already alive with stories. So let me ask you, what makes a place home? Is it the buildings we construct, or the memories we carve into the earth itself? Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, the island we now call Montreal was known by another name, Tiohtià, where the currents divide in the Mohawk language. This wasn't wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was a thriving intersection of nations, a crossroads where the Haudenosaunee, the Algonquin, the Huron-Wendat, and other indigenous peoples met, traded, and lived for thousands of years. Picture this: villages stretching along the river, fields of corn, beans, and squash, cultivated with ancient knowledge passed down through generations. The St. Lawrence wasn't just a river, it was a highway, a provider, a sacred presence. Canoes carved from birch bark glided through its waters, carrying traders, diplomats, and families between communities that spanned hundreds of miles. These weren't isolated tribes living in silence. No, this was a complex network of alliances, commerce, and cultural exchange. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois by Europeans, was one of the most sophisticated political systems in the world at that time. Think about that for a moment. While European monarchs ruled by divine right, indigenous nations here governed through councils, debate, and consensus. And here's something most people don't realize. The strategic importance of this location was understood long before any French explorer set foot here. Mount Royal, the hill that would later give Montreal its name, served as a lookout point. From its summit you could see for miles, monitor river traffic, spot approaching visitors, whether they came in peace or with other intentions. Trade was the lifeblood of this region. Furs, particularly beaver pelts, were highly valued, not just for warmth, but as symbols of status and craftsmanship. Wampum belts, intricate designs made from shell beads, weren't mere decoration. They were historical records, treaties, sacred agreements woven into art. Each pattern told a story, preserved a promise. But let's be clear about something. This wasn't a paradise frozen in time. These were real people facing real challenges, territorial disputes, resource management, shifting alliances. Life demanded resilience, adaptability, deep knowledge of the seasons, the land, the animals. When autumn arrived, communities prepared for winter with meticulous care. Fish were smoked and dried. Corn was stored in underground caches. Hunting parties ventured into the forests for deer and moose. Winter here wasn't a gentle season. Temperatures could plunge to brutal lows. Snow could bury entire villages. Survival required not just individual strength, but collective cooperation. Spiritual life was woven into everything. The river, the forests, the animals, all held sacred significance. Ceremonies marked the seasons, honored the dead, celebrated births, and sealed alliances. Elders held the wisdom of generations. Storytellers kept history alive through oral tradition, and healers understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants. So why does this matter? Because when we talk about Montreal's history, we can't start in 1642 with French settlers. That's like opening a book halfway through and claiming it's the beginning. The foundation of this city, its location, its strategic value, its role as a meeting place, all of that was established thousands of years before Europeans arrived. And here's the question we need to ask ourselves. When those first French ships finally appeared on the St. Lawrence in the early 1600s, what did the indigenous peoples see? Opportunity, threat, curiosity? The answer, as with most of history, is complicated. The French didn't arrive in an empty land. They arrived in a land already shaped by human hands, governed by established nations, connected by ancient trade routes. What happened next would transform this crossroads forever. But that transformation didn't erase what came before. It couldn't. The rivers still flow. The mountain still stands. And the indigenous peoples who first called this place home? They're still here, still part of Montreal's story, still shaping its future. So here's where things get interesting. It's May the 17th, 1642. Imagine a small flotilla of boats approaching the island from downriver. Wooden vessels, loaded with supplies, livestock, and about 50 French colonists who've just made one of the most difficult journeys of their lives. Who were these people? And more importantly, what on earth made them think starting a settlement here was a good idea? Let me introduce you to the key players. First, there's Paul de Chomedey, Sieur de Maisonneuve, a soldier deeply religious and convinced he's on a divine mission. Then there's Jeanne Mance, a remarkable woman who would become one of New France's most important figures. She wasn't just along for the ride. She was a founding leader, a nurse, an administrator. In an era when women rarely held such positions, Jeanne Mance was essential to the colony's survival. Now, you might be wondering, why here? Quebec City already existed upriver, founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608. But this location, this island where the Ottawa River meets the St. Lawrence, this was different. This was the gateway to the interior, the last navigable point before the Lachine Rapids made river travel impossible. But here's the thing that really gets me. These settlers weren't primarily motivated by profit or imperial expansion. They called their settlement Ville-Marie, City of Mary, and they saw it as a religious mission, a place to convert indigenous peoples to Catholicism and create a Christian community in the wilderness. This was the vision of the Société de Notre-Dame de Montreal, a religious society in France that funded the entire expedition. Pretty idealistic, right? Maybe even naive. Because reality had other plans. The first years were brutal. And, I mean truly brutal. The settlers built a wooden fort near the riverbank, surrounded by a protective palisade. Inside, a chapel, a hospital, a few rough buildings. Outside, endless forest, and increasingly, conflict. See, the timing couldn't have been worse. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Huron-Wendat nations, along with their French allies, were locked in what historians call the Beaver Wars, a series of devastating conflicts over fur trade territory and resources. Ville-Marie found itself right in the middle of this struggle. Attacks came frequently. Settlers working in the fields might suddenly find themselves under assault. Hunting parties disappeared. The colonists lived in constant fear, rarely venturing beyond sight of the fort without armed escorts. At night, guards watched from wooden towers, listening for any sound in the darkness. Can you imagine that? Trying to build a new life while knowing that any morning could be your last? The colony nearly collapsed several times in those early years. Food ran short, diseases swept through, reinforcements from France arrived irregularly, if at all. But here's what fascinates me about Jeanne Mance. In 1645, just 3 years after arriving, she founded the Hôtel Dieu de Montreal, the first hospital in the settlement. Think about the courage that took. Resources were scarce, survival was uncertain, yet she insisted on creating a place of healing. That hospital still exists today, nearly 400 years later. Maisonneuve proved to be a capable military leader, organizing the defense, maintaining discipline, refusing to abandon the settlement even when advisors in Quebec urged him to give up. There's a famous story, probably embellished but revealing nonetheless, about Maisonneuve planting a cross on Mount Royal's summit, fulfilling a vow he'd made during a dangerous flood. Symbol or not, it represented something this colony would endure. And slowly, despite everything, it did. More settlers arrived. The Sulpician Order, another Catholic religious organization, took control of the island's seigneury in 1663, bringing money, organization, and more priests. They built a grand seminary, established schools, and began transforming Ville-Marie from a precarious mission into something more permanent. The relationship with indigenous peoples was complex and constantly evolving. The French needed indigenous allies for trade, for military support, for survival itself. Missionaries learned native languages, lived in indigenous communities, though their goal of religious conversion created its own tensions and tragedies. Meanwhile, the fur trade began to dominate everything. Beaver pelts were becoming incredibly valuable in European markets. Fashionable felt hats made from beaver fur were all the rage in Paris and London. French traders called coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, ventured deep into the interior, establishing relationships with indigenous trappers, bringing back fortunes in furs. And here's where Ville-Marie's location became absolutely crucial. This was the collection point, the marketplace where furs from thousands of miles away arrived before being shipped to France. The little religious mission was becoming a commercial hub, whether its founders liked it or not. By the 1670s, the settlement's character was changing. Yes, it remained deeply Catholic. Churches and convents dominated the landscape, but profit and piety were learning to coexist. Merchants built stone houses. Warehouses lined the waterfront. The population grew slowly but steadily. The name evolved too. People increasingly called it Montreal, after Mount Royal, the hill Cartier had named over a century earlier. Ville-Marie became Montreal. The City of Mary became the Mountain City. What started as a fragile religious outpost had become something its founders never quite imagined: a strategic fortress, a commercial center, and the launching point for French expansion into the heart of North America. Let's talk about something that might surprise you. For nearly 2 centuries, the entire economy of this region, the wealth, the power, the very reason Montreal existed, depended on a single animal, the beaver. Not gold, not spices, not timber, beaver pelts. Now I know what you're thinking. How could a rodent possibly build an empire? But here's the thing. In 17th and 18th century Europe, beaver fur wasn't just valuable, it was essential. The undercoat of beaver pelts, when processed correctly, created the finest felt imaginable. And felt meant hats. Tricorn hats, top hats, the fashionable headwear that every gentleman in Paris, London, and Amsterdam desperately wanted. So imagine this. A hat worn by some aristocrat in Versailles began its journey as a beaver swimming in a stream somewhere near Lake Superior, trapped by an indigenous hunter who'd never seen an ocean, traded to a French coureur de bois who paddled it hundreds of miles, sold at a market in Montreal, shipped across the Atlantic, processed in a European workshop, and finally placed on someone's head. That's globalization in the 1600s. Montreal became the beating heart of this entire system. Every spring, as the ice broke on the St. Lawrence, the city transformed into an enormous outdoor market. Indigenous traders arrived in massive canoe flotillas. Some convoys included hundreds of canoes, laden with furs accumulated over the winter months. The riverfront became a chaos of negotiation, celebration, and commerce. And what did they trade for? European goods that had become essential: metal tools, knives, cooking pots, cloth, blankets, and yes, firearms. This wasn't some innocent exchange of trinkets. These were sophisticated economic relationships where both sides calculated value, leverage, and long-term advantage. But let me tell you about the real adventurers of this era, the voyageurs. These were the men who paddled the massive canoes, called canots de maître, from Montreal into the vast interior. Picture this: canoes up to 36 feet long, carrying 4 tons of cargo, paddled by 8 to 12 men, traveling thousands of miles through rapids, across lakes, over portage trails. The voyager life was incredibly hard. They paddled up to 16 hours a day, covering 50 to 60 miles in good conditions. Their diet consisted mainly of pork fat, dried peas, and biscuits, plus whatever fish they could catch. At portages, where waterfalls or rapids blocked the route, they carried everything on their backs. Some portages stretched for miles. Can you imagine carrying 90-pound packs over rough terrain, making multiple trips, then paddling until darkness fell? Yet these men developed their own culture, their own songs, their own pride. They saw themselves as elite, the toughest, the most skilled, the true masters of the wilderness. Many took Indigenous wives, creating Métis communities throughout the interior. They learned native languages, adopted survival techniques, became cultural intermediaries between worlds. The trade routes they followed were astonishing. From Montreal, voyageurs paddled up the Ottawa River, crossed to Lake Nipissing, continued to Georgian Bay, then into Lake Superior and beyond, all the way to Lake Winnipeg and the Saskatchewan River. Some journeys took months. Many men never returned, claimed by accidents, drowning, or disease. And Montreal grew rich from all of this. Merchants built stone mansions. The Sulpicians constructed impressive buildings. By the early 1700s, the city had protective walls, churches with silver bells, a thriving commercial district. Yes, it was still small, maybe a few thousand permanent residents, but its influence stretched across half a continent. Here's something crucial to understand. This wasn't really French control of the interior. It was partnership, negotiation, and often dependence. The French needed indigenous knowledge, indigenous labor, indigenous diplomatic networks. Tribes like the Ojibwe, Cree, and Ottawa weren't passive participants. They were active agents who played European powers against each other, secured favorable terms, and maintained their own sovereignty. But the beaver population was declining. By the mid-1700s, trappers had to venture ever farther to find productive hunting grounds. What had once taken a week's paddle now required months. The easy wealth was disappearing and competition was intensifying. Because the French weren't alone anymore. The British, operating out of Hudson Bay to the north and from their 13 colonies to the south, were aggressively pursuing the same trade. And they often offered better prices, better goods, more reliable supply lines. Montreal's merchants started to worry. The British were methodical, well-organized, and increasingly powerful. Meanwhile, France seemed to treat New France as an afterthought, sending limited supplies and minimal military support. The fur trade had made Montreal. It had transformed a religious mission into a commercial powerhouse, created fortunes, opened the continent, and connected European markets to indigenous trappers across thousands of miles. But empires built on animal pelts are fragile things, and by the 1750s, a larger conflict was brewing, one that would determine not just who controlled the fur trade, but who would control all of North America. The world was changing, and Montreal, whether it realized it or not, was about to face its greatest crisis yet. September 8th, 1760. Picture the scene. British warships on the St. Lawrence, thousands of redcoats surrounding the city, cannons pointed at Montreal's walls. Inside, French Governor Vaudreuil faces an impossible choice: fight and watch the city burn, or surrender and hope for mercy. He surrendered. Without firing a shot, Montreal, and with it all of New France, fell to the British Empire. Now here's what's remarkable. This wasn't the end of French Montreal. It was, in a strange way, the beginning of something entirely new. The British were practical. They'd just conquered a territory filled with French-speaking Catholics who vastly outnumbered the English-speaking Protestant newcomers. Smart rulers don't immediately antagonize the population they need to govern. So they made a calculation. Let the French keep their language, their religion, their civil law. The Quebec Act of 1774 essentially allowed French-Canadian society to continue largely unchanged. What emerged was unlike anywhere else in North America, a city divided yet interdependent. The French remained the majority, controlling the Catholic Church, the professions, the cultural life. But the British controlled commerce, banking, and political power. Two solitudes, as they'd later be called, living side by side. Walk through Montreal in the early 1800s and you'd see this division everywhere. The wealthy English merchants built grand homes in the Square Mile, near Mount Royal. They founded banks, created the Montreal Stock Exchange, established exclusive clubs. Meanwhile, the French populated the eastern quarters, attended Mass at Notre Dame Basilica, preserved their traditions. But then came the transformation that changed everything, the Industrial Revolution. Montreal's location, that same strategic position that made it perfect for the fur trade, made it ideal for industry. The Lachine Canal, completed in 1825, bypassed the rapids and connected the city directly to the Great Lakes. Suddenly, goods could flow from the interior to the Atlantic without interruption. Factories sprouted along the canal, foundries, textile mills, locomotive works. The Grand Trunk Railway made Montreal its headquarters. By the 1850s, the city was Canada's undisputed economic engine, its largest city, its busiest port, its industrial powerhouse. Smokestacks blackened the sky. Steam whistles marked the working day. The smell of coal and industry filled the air, and people came. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine crowded into Griffintown. Jewish families from Eastern Europe established communities around Saint Laurent Boulevard. Italians, Chinese, Greeks, Portuguese, each wave added new layers to Montreal's character. This wasn't always peaceful. The Irish and French Catholics sometimes clashed with Protestant English. Workers fought for better conditions in dangerous factories. Epidemics swept through crowded tenements. Montreal's growth was messy, contentious, often brutal. But something else was happening too. French Canadians were slowly reclaiming economic and political power. By the early 1900s, French-owned businesses were competing successfully. French politicians were gaining influence. The old British dominance was eroding. Then came the quiet revolution of the 1960s. Quebec awakened with astonishing speed. The Catholic Church's grip on education and social services broke almost overnight. The provincial government expanded dramatically. Maître chez nous, masters in our own house, became the rallying cry. Montreal became the stage for this transformation. New universities opened, modern office towers rose downtown. The metro system, inaugurated in 1966, brought sleek rubber-tired trains underground, and in 1967, Montreal hosted the world. Expo 67. Have you seen the photographs? Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, the biosphere, shimmering on an island in the river. Futuristic pavilions from dozens of nations, over 50 million visitors that summer. For one glorious season, Montreal was the center of the world, a symbol of possibility and progress. But political tensions were intensifying. Some Quebecers wanted independence. The FLQ crisis of 1970 brought armed soldiers into the streets. The 1976 election of the separatist Parti Québécois shocked the English establishment. Many businesses relocated to Toronto. The 1980 referendum on sovereignty failed, but only narrowly. Through all this upheaval, Montreal kept evolving. The city that English merchants once dominated became unmistakably French in character. Language laws made French the public language of business and government. The cultural scene exploded. Theater, music, festivals, comedy. Today's Montreal is something its founders could never have imagined. It's thoroughly modern yet deeply historical. You can walk cobblestone streets in Old Montreal, where 17th century buildings still stand, then ride the metro to ultra-modern neighborhoods where half a dozen languages fill the air. The fur trade is ancient history. British economic dominance ended decades ago, but the cultural richness, the linguistic duality, the immigrant energy, those define the city now. Montreal became a cultural capital not despite its complicated history, but because of it. Every conflict, every wave of newcomers, every political crisis added layers of complexity and creativity. So here's the final question. What makes Montreal special? Is it the festivals, Jazz Fest, Just for Laughs, countless others? The food scene blending French technique with global ingredients, the bilingualism that frustrates some but enriches everyone. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Montreal matters because it never resolved its contradictions. It never became purely French or English, purely traditional or modern, purely anything. It remained deliciously complicated, perpetually negotiating between past and future, between cultures, between visions of what a city can be. From Tiohtià to Ville-Marie to Montreal, from Indigenous crossroads to French mission to British conquest to cultural powerhouse. This city has always been a meeting place. And that, more than anything else, is Montreal's true inheritance. The rivers still divide the currents. The mountain still watches over it all. And the story? The story continues.